Disguised millionaire delivery guy breaks down when her one word turns his world upside down. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is now. Subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Rain slapped the windshield, blurring the world beyond Ethan Hayes' sleek black sedan. The engine sputtered, then died, stranding him on a narrow street in an old part of town. He cursed under his breath, glancing at his watch. 2:47 p.m. A board meeting loomed in an hour. He jabbed at his phone, but the signal was dead. The downpour roared, mocking his tailored suit and meticulous plans. Across the street, a faded sign flickered in the storm. Piano tuning and repair. A basement shop, its glow faint but warm, like a flame in a paper lantern. Ethan grabbed his briefcase, yanked his coat over his head, and dashed through the rain. The bell above the door jingled as he stumbled inside, dripping and annoyed. "Rough day, Mr. Hayes?" A voice, calm as a steady stream, cut through the patter of rain. An older man, wiry with silver hair, looked up from a workbench cluttered with tools and piano strings. His hazel eyes softened, unhurried, but a knowing smile played at his lips. Ethan blinked, startled. "Just Ethan," he said, assuming a guess, shaking water from his sleeve. "Need a phone. Car's dead." The man, Art, his apron red, nodded, gesturing to a rotary phone by the wall. "Help yourself. Tea while you wait? Storm's not letting up." Ethan waved off the offer, his tone clipped. "No time." He dialed roadside assistance, but the line crackled, useless. He slammed the receiver down, frustration coiling tighter. Art didn't flinch. He poured tea anyway, sliding a chipped mug across the counter. "Sit a spell. Nothing hurries a storm." Ethan's jaw tightened, but the shop's quiet buzz, creaking floorboards, the faint clink of tools, eased his edge. His gaze drifted to an old grand piano in the corner. Its keys yellowed, its wood worn, but alive. A flicker of memory stirred, like a note half remembered. His father's hands on keys long ago. "Play it?" Art asked, catching his look. His voice was light, but his eyes held a spark, as if he saw more than Ethan let on. "Haven't touched one in years," Ethan muttered, turning away. "Not my thing anymore." Art shrugged, his smile unchanged. "Just try it. She's out of tune, but she's got heart." Ethan hesitated, the board meeting fading against the rain's steady pulse. He set his briefcase down and crossed to the piano. The bench creaked as he sat. His fingers, stiff from years of keyboards and contracts, hovered over the keys. He pressed a note. It rang, slightly sour but warm. Another followed, then a halting melody. Chopin, maybe. Something his father used to play. Art watched, his hands still, his head tilted like he was listening to more than the music. Ethan's playing grew surer, the notes pulling at a knot in his chest. For a moment, the storm, the meeting, the broken car, they vanished. There was only the piano, the shop, and a lightness he hadn't felt in years. "You've got a gift," Art said softly, breaking the spell. "What's your name, son?" "Ethan Hayes," he answered, fingers pausing mid-chord. Art's expression shifted, a shadow crossing his face like dawn revealing a hidden path. He leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. "Hayes, you say? Knew a Hayes once. Thomas, fine pianist, heart as big as this town." Ethan froze, the name a blade through time. His father gone when Ethan was 9, his music a ghost Ethan had buried under boardrooms and ambition. His heart stirred, a weight awakening. "You knew him?" Art nodded, his eyes distant yet sharp. "Taught him, years ago, never forgot him." He turned back to his tools, but his silence held weight, as if he carried more than he'd said. The bell jingled. A woman stepped in, shaking rain from her coat. "Dad, you forgot lunch again," she called, then stopped, her gaze locking on Ethan. A flicker of recognition passed, unspoken, like a ripple over a still pond. Rain drummed the shop's windows, a steady pulse matching Ethan's racing heart. Thomas Hayes, his father's name lingered, heavy as the storm outside. Art's words, soft but piercing, had cracked something open, and Ethan couldn't look away from the old man's steady gaze. The woman at the door, Art's daughter, he guessed, set a paper bag on the counter, her eyes flicking between them, sensing the moment's weight. She poured tea from a thermos, her movements quick, and slid a cup to Ethan. "Dad's stories about Thomas were legends," she said, her voice warm but holding a trace of sadness, as if she'd heard the grief beneath his tales, before stepping back, lingering by the door. "You taught him?" Ethan's voice was sharp, almost accusing, as if Art had stolen a piece of his past. He stood, the piano bench scraping the floor, his hands clenched. "When? How long?" Art wiped his hands on his apron, slow and deliberate, like a farmer tending a field. Long time ago, Thomas was young, full of fire, came to me for lessons every week, rain or shine. His eyes softened, drifting to a memory. Loved Beethoven, played like he was chasing something bigger than himself. He was one of many, kids from the neighborhood, each with their own spark, though none quite like him. Ethan's voice faltered, caught on grief. He remembered his father's hands on the keys, music filling their small house before his mother's quiet withdrawal after Thomas's death. Those memories were fragments, faded like old cloth. He never mentioned you, he said, the words bitter. Art shrugged, unoffended. Didn't need to. Music was his way of talking. He turned to his workbench, picking up a tuning fork, his movements a beat too slow, as if weighing what to say next. Ethan paced, his polished shoes clicking on the worn floor. The shop buzzed, its air thick with polish and time. His gaze snagged on a photograph tucked under sheet music on the workbench. His father, young, maybe 20, grinning at a piano, hands poised mid-chord. Ethan's breath caught, recognition slicing through him. "Where'd you get this?" he demanded, snatching it up. The paper trembled in his hand. Art glanced over, his expression unreadable. "Kept it. Thomas gave it to me after a recital. Proud moment. After he passed, I stepped back from teaching for a while, just tuned strings to keep his music close." He set the tuning fork down, his voice dropping. "He was proud of you too, you know. Talked about his boy all the time." Ethan's heart stuttered, the photograph a weight he couldn't hold. He clutched it, unsure if he could bear its truth. He turned it over, saw his father's scrawled handwriting. "To Art for the music. Tautintinich." Ethan had been 9, too young to grasp the illness that stole Thomas, but old enough to feel the silence left behind. He wanted to ask more, to tear open the past, but the words stuck, caught like a song he'd forgotten how to sing. Art moved to the piano, brushing a hand over its aged wood. This was his favorite to play on. Said it had soul. He struck a key, the note off but warm, a silent call. "You sounded like him just now. Same fire." Ethan shook his head, shoving the paper back onto the bench. "I'm not him." He cut off, the memory of his father's funeral flashing bright and cold. The music stopped that day, buried with Thomas under a gray sky. Art didn't push. He picked up a wrench, turning back to his work, but his silence was loud, heavy with things unsaid. Ethan felt it, the gap between what Art knew and what he shared, like a melody held back. He wanted to demand answers, to know why this man, this shop, held pieces of his father he'd never seen. But the shop's quiet and the tea's warmth dulled his edge, pulling him into a stillness he didn't trust. The tow truck had come and gone, his car now waiting outside, but Ethan lingered, the shop's pull stronger than the road. He grabbed his briefcase, ready to leave, but his eyes fell on the photograph again. It sat, a silent call, its edges curling like a leaf in autumn. He couldn't leave it. He slipped it into his pocket, the act impulsive, almost guilty. "Keep it," Art said without looking up, as if he'd felt it. "It's yours." Ethan nodded, his breath unsteady, heavy with loss. He stepped toward the door, the bells chime waiting. Olivia lingered, her silhouette soft against the rain's gray curtain, then slipped out, her steps fading. The rain softened, like a candle's flicker at dusk. Ethan paused, hand on the knob, the photograph burning in his pocket, tugging at him. The bell stayed silent. Ethan turned back, his voice low. "What happened to him?" Art's hand steadied, his eyes meeting Ethan's, holding a secret as deep as rain. "Plenty," he murmured and said no more. Sunlight danced on the shop's windows, but Ethan felt no lighter. Art's words, "plenty," hung like a cord unresolved, pulling him back to the piano bench. The photograph of his father burned in his pocket, its edges sharp. Its image, Thomas grinning at the piano, still shook him, a weight he carried quietly now. He sat, briefcase forgotten by the door, the bell silent. Art leaned against the workbench, his steady gaze waiting, as if he'd known Ethan wouldn't leave. "What do you mean, plenty?" Ethan's voice was taut, a wire ready to snap. "What else about him?" Art set down a tuning wrench, its clink sharp in the quiet. He crossed his arms, his cardigan sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing hands scarred from years of work. "Thomas wasn't just a student," he said, voice low, like a stream over stones. "He had dreams, big ones. Wanted to build a music school, a place for kids who couldn't afford lessons. Said it'd give them a voice." Ethan's breath caught, a warmth rising within. A music school. His father's face flashed, laughing, hands dancing over keys, promising Ethan they'd play together forever. But that was before the hospital, the silence, the empty house. His mother, overwhelmed by grief, had faded into her own silence, leaving Ethan to carry Thomas's absence alone. "He never told me," Ethan said, the words bitter, almost a child's complaint. Art's gaze softened, but he didn't look away. "You were young. He didn't want to burden you, but he believed in it, thought music could fix what words couldn't." He stepped to the piano, tapping a key. The note rang, slightly off, a path to Thomas's memory. "He'd sit right where you are, talking about it. Said his boy loved music too." Ethan's hands clenched, nails biting his palms. "I did," he snapped, then stopped, the admission raw. He'd loved it. The piano, the way his father's playing filled the room, how Thomas taught him a simple waltz, their hands stumbling together, laughing. But after the funeral, the keys felt cold. The music of betrayal. He'd locked it away, trading it for spreadsheets, control, apex innovations. "I stopped. It didn't matter anymore." Art shook his head, a faint smile tugging his lips. "Doesn't work that way. Music's in you, like blood. You played today." Sounded just like him. Ethan stood, pacing to the window, sunlight casting glints like scattered pearls. Art's words were a mirror, showing a boy he'd buried. He wanted to argue, to say he was nothing like his father, that he'd built a life without music. But the photograph, the melody he'd played, the shop's quiet, they pressed against his walls, cracking them. "Tell me more," he said, turning back, his voice quieter but urgent. He sank onto the bench, the weight of Thomas's hope pressing him still. Then a spark of need flickered. Answers, more of his father. What happened to the school? Why didn't he do it? Art's smile faded, his eyes clouding. Life got in the way. Work, bills, then he got sick. Fast, never had the chance. He paused, rubbing a thumb over his knuckles. Tore him up, knowing he might not see it through. But he never stopped hoping. Ethan's heart stuttered, heavy with loss. Ethan, 9 years old, sat by his bed, sensing but not understanding the weight of his father's fading strength. He remembered Thomas's weak smile, his hand heavy on Ethan's, saying, "Keep playing, kid." Ethan hadn't. He'd run from it, from him. He sank back onto the bench, the piano waiting, a quiet summons. "I didn't know," he whispered, more to himself than Art. The shop breathed, its corners holding echoes of the past, steady and still. Art stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "You were a kid. He didn't want you carrying that weight, but he saw you, Ethan. Saw the music in you, even then." The words landed like a stone in a pond, rippling through Ethan's heart. He looked at Art, at the man who'd known his father's dreams, who'd kept his photograph, who'd heard Ethan play and seen Thomas in him. It was too much, yet not enough. His father wasn't just a memory now. He was a man with plans, with hope, with a son he'd believed in. The bell jingled, soft but clear. Olivia stepped in, a scarf loose around her neck, carrying a small box. She paused, sensing the air's weight, her dark eyes flicking between them. "Brought lunch, Dad," she said, then added, her voice light. "Looks like I'm interrupting something big." She set the box down, lingering, her fingers brushing the counter as she watched Ethan, a quiet thread in the moment. Ethan's fingers traced the keys, instinctive, and a single note sang out, clear despite the piano's flaws. He froze, the sound reshaping him, like moonlight on a woven mat. Art nodded, his eyes proud, as if he'd been waiting for this. Olivia's smile was small, encouraging, tying them together in the shop's glow. Ethan's car purred now, fixed days ago, but the piano shop drew him back. He drove through the quiet town, sunlight glinting off damp leaves like scattered coins. His suit was crisp, but his schedule packed. The photograph in his pocket, his father at the piano, pressed against his heart, stirring a quiet ache. He parked outside the shop, its faded sign a beacon. The bell jingled as he stepped inside, briefcase in hand, his steps steadier now. Art looked up, a tuning fork paused mid-air. His gaze was steady, like a tuner's ear. "Back again, Ethan." He grinned, catching the warmth beneath Ethan's polished facade. Ethan nodded, half smiling, setting his briefcase down. "Caught me." The shop's rack sang of forgotten tunes, its air alive with possibility. He glanced at the piano, its keys beckoning. Got time for a lesson? Art's smile widened. Always. He gestured to the bench. Let's try something simple. One of your dad's favorites. Ethan sat, the bench creaking under him. His fingers, stiff from years of typing, hovered over the keys. Art leaned in, adjusting his posture with a nudge. Relax your shoulders. Feel the music. Don't fight it. He hummed Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, slow and haunting. Ethan followed, his notes clumsy, then smoother, each chord a thread to his father's hands, his father's dreams. The shop faded. Tools, workbench, world outside. Only the piano remained, Art's guidance, and a warmth Ethan hadn't felt since boyhood. His fingers found the rhythm, the melody rising like a path through bamboo. Art nodded, voice soft. There it is. You've got his fire. Ethan's heart lifted, a burden easing. He played on, the notes stitching a wound he hadn't named. Art stepped back, hands folded, watching like a teacher proud of a student finding their way. The bell jingled, sharp. Ethan's fingers faltered, the melody breaking. Olivia stepped in, dark hair catching the light, a paper bag in her hand. Dad, you forgot lunch again, she called, then stopped, her gaze locking on Ethan. Her eyes widened, recognition flashing. Ethan in a suit, not the delivery guy she'd met weeks ago. Ethan froze. That day he'd posed as a delivery guy, testing her character on a whim, a guarded habit. Olivia's brow furrowed, then softened, a half-smile forming. Not bad for a delivery guy, she teased. Ethan grinned, sheepish. Sorry about the disguise. Old habit, checking who people really are. Olivia raised an eyebrow, her smile warm. Next time, just be you. Art crossed the shop, movements unhurried. Olivia, this is Ethan Hayes, he said, tone deliberate. Ethan, my daughter. Olivia. He paused, a glint in his eye. Saw your name in the papers years ago, Apex's rising star. Then I saw you and I knew. Thomas's son. The words landed like a stone in a pond. Olivia's lips parted, her gaze darting to Ethan. Apex's star, huh? She said, her tone light but curious. Dad's got an eye for spotting more than piano skills. Ethan's pulse quickened. Art had known from the start who he was, what he carried. The shop, the piano, the photograph. It wasn't chance. It was a thread woven through time, tying him to his father, to Art, to this moment. Olivia set her bag on the counter, lingering, her fingers brushing the wood. Nice to see you again, she said, her eyes searching. She leaned against the counter, a quiet presence tying the moment together. Art took the bag, his smile unchanged. Thanks, love. Stay a bit. Olivia glanced at Ethan, her smile curious. You're full of surprises, she said, nodding at Art's revelation. Maybe next time. She stepped outside, pausing through the window, sketching in the sunlight, her silhouette a quiet thread. Ethan returned to the shop the next day, and the next, the shop a refuge from his endless meetings. Ethan stared at the keys, Art's words replaying. Thomas's son. The lesson, the shop, Olivia's arrival. They were pieces of a pattern he hadn't seen, a melody he was only beginning to hear. He looked at Art, who'd returned to his workbench, humming the sonata, as if nothing had happened. You knew, Ethan said, not a question. Art met his gaze, his eyes clear, like a glow in a woven lamp. Knew enough to get you here. He struck the tuning fork, its hum filling the shop, and turned back to his work, leaving Ethan with the piano, the past, and a truth that felt like home. A week of daily visits had turned the piano shop into Ethan's sanctuary. Board meetings, Apex Innovations emails. They dimmed when he parked outside Art's basement, the faded sign a quiet call. His phone buzzed today, a product launch teetering on failure, Apex's latest crisis. He silenced it, his breath steady, choosing the shop's pulse over the boardroom's clamor. His deputy could handle the fallout for now. He pushed open the door, the bells jingle a greeting, and found Art at his workbench, tools clinking softly. Art looked up, his silver hair catching the afternoon light. Ready for another go? He asked, nodding at the piano, its keys a silent invitation. Ethan shed his suit jacket, rolling up his sleeves. Always. He sat at the bench, the wood warm, like a friend's voice. Art suggested Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat, guiding his hands with a gentle tap. Softer. Let it breathe. Ethan played, notes drifting like a breeze through bamboo, each one a step closer to the boy who'd loved music before Thomas's passing. The shop's space pulsed with silent notes, Ethan's shoulders easing, his guarded edges softening. He laughed when he missed a note, the sound bright, unguarded. A child peered through the window, maybe a neighbor hoping for lessons. Art's shop, a local legend, clutching a violin case, then darted off, called by a parent's voice. Art grinned, his eyes softening. That's it. You're waking up. The bell chimed, clear. Olivia stepped in, scarf loose around her neck, a small box in her hand. She paused, watching Ethan at the piano. Didn't expect you here again, she said, her tone light but warm. No more delivery guy tricks, right? Apex's star? Ethan's fingers stilled, the nocturne fading. He grinned, the disguise a shared jest. Just me now. Olivia's smile deepened, her dark eyes holding his, seeing the man beneath the title. Art crossed to her, taking the box. Join us, Liv. Ethan's getting good. His glance at Ethan carried weight, testing the air between them. Olivia set her bag down, leaning against the counter, sketchbook under her arm. Play something, she said, her challenge soft, like a flame in a paper lantern. Ethan started the nocturne again, fingers sure, the melody a confession. Olivia listened, head tilted, fingers tracing the counter's edge. When he finished, she clapped lightly, her smile genuine. Not bad for a CEO. He laughed, open, easy. Not bad for a jeweler. Her designs, he'd learned, were precise yet soulful, like Art's tuning. Her jewelry, sold across the city, carried the same heart she brought to the shop. They talked, her latest piece, his chaotic work week, their words weaving through the shop's pulse. Olivia passed him a sketch of a pendant, her latest design, her touch lingering, a spark of something more. Apex doesn't deserve you full-time? She teased, her voice soft, eyes bright. Art watched, silent, his hands busy with a piano string. Ethan caught his eye, sensing a story unspoken. What's on your mind, Art? He asked, his tone direct. Art set his tools down, gaze distant. You remind me of someone, he said, voice low. Thomas, not just the music, the way you carry loss but keep going? He paused, rubbing a thumb over his knuckles. He was my student, but more. Like family. Losing him, it broke something in me. Ethan's breath caught, a spark kindling within. Olivia looked at her father, eyes softening, as if she'd long known this pain from his quiet moments. You never told me that, Ethan said, his voice a whisper. Art met his gaze, eyes pained but clear. Didn't need to. I kept teaching, kept tuning. But Thomas's death, it made me scared I'd fail others, and scared I'd lose them too. He gestured to the shop, the piano, the tools. This place, it's my way of holding on. Its music could live on, maybe in a school. The words rippled through Ethan, revealing Art's wound, deep as his own. Olivia reached for her father's hand, her touch brief but steady. You didn't fail him, Dad, she said, voice firm, then stayed, her sketches filling the silence, leaving only when the light began to fade. Ethan stood, crossing to the workbench, a tuning wrench in reach. Mind if I help? He asked, the offer impulsive, a small act to share the load. Art's smile returned, faint but real. Sure, son, start with that string. They worked side by side, the shop's pulse a quiet song. Olivia sketched, her pencil moving, mirroring their craft, tying them like a family mending under a shadowed ridge. Art's confession lingered, a crack in the shop's light, revealing a deeper rift, his fear of failing, of losing again. Ethan felt it, a need to heal not just himself, but the man who'd given him back his father's music. The shop's light was softer today, late afternoon sun casting shadows across the floorboards. Ethan pushed through the door, the bell's jingle faint against the quiet. His suit was wrinkled, tie loosened, a crack in his polished armor. Apex had kept him up all night, the failed product launch he'd ignored yesterday, demanding attention. His team, led by his deputy, wrestling with the collapse. He'd silenced his phone, its buzz a cage he was tired of. I'm tired of Apex owning me, he told himself, craving time for music, for what mattered. It wasn't the numbers or boardroom that weighed on him. It was Art's confession, the crack in his voice when he'd spoken of Thomas, of fear, of loss. Ethan hadn't slept, the shop's pull stronger than ever. Art sat at his workbench, a piano string stretched taut under his wrench. He looked up, his gaze catching Ethan's restless stride. Rough day, son? His voice was steady, but the lines on his face seemed deeper, etched by their last talk. You could say that, Ethan muttered, dropping his briefcase by the door. A child peered through the window, one of the neighborhood kids drawn to Art's shop, a local legend, clutching a violin case, then ran off, summoned by a shout. Ethan crossed to the piano, its keys a link to Thomas's spirit. He sat, fingers brushing the wood, but he didn't play. The shop's walls hummed with faded melodies, urging him to speak. I can't stop thinking about what you said, about my dad, about failing. Art set the wrench down, his hands still, his gaze fixed on Ethan. Didn't mean to stir up trouble, he said, soft as a breeze through bamboo. Just truth. Ethan's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice low but urgent. I've been running from it, Art. From him, from music. I built Apex to prove something, but it's a cage. I thought success would fill the hole he left. He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping. It didn't. I'm still empty. The words hung in the shop, raw, like a note struck too hard. Art didn't flinch. He stood crossing to the piano, his cardigan sleeves rolled up, revealing scars from years of tuning. He sat beside Ethan, the bench groaning under their weight. You're not empty, he said, tone firm but kind. You're here playing again. That's not nothing. Ethan's breath caught, a weight stirring within. He stared at the keys, their worn edges a map of his father's hands. But I forgot him, forgot what he loved. I let it go. His voice cracked, a confession unplanned. I'm not the son he wanted. Art's hand rested on his shoulder, light but steady, like a village elder calming a storm. Thomas didn't want a perfect son. He wanted you to live, to find joy. He saw it in you, even when you were small. He paused, eyes distant, seeing a memory. He'd be proud, Ethan. Not of your company, but of this. Sitting here, trying. Ethan's heart stirred, the words slicing through years of guilt. He wanted to believe it, but the hole was deep, carved by a boy who'd stopped playing, who'd traded music for control. He looked at Art, the man who'd known his father's heart, who carried his own wounds. What about you? He asked, voice quieter. You said you're scared of failing, of losing people. How do you keep going? Art's hand fell, his gaze dropping to the piano. The shop's hum stilled, the air thick with grief. I don't, he said, barely a whisper. Not always. Thomas's death, it broke me. I stopped teaching for years, hid in this shop, tuning strings to hold on to him. I've seen so many come and go, each one a risk. He rubbed his knuckles, holding pain at bay. But kids came, needing lessons. Olivia pushed me. I started again, but the fear's still there. Every student feels like a chance to fail. Ethan saw Art anew, a man of quiet battles like a farmer tending a field through drought. The shop, the piano, the tools, they were Art's way of clinging to Thomas, to hope, despite the cracks in his heart. The bell jingled, soft but piercing. Olivia stepped in, scarf trailing, sketchbook under her arm. She paused, sensing the weight, her dark eyes flicking from Ethan to her father. Everything okay? She asked, her voice gentle, like a flame in a paper lantern. She sat, her sketchbook open, joining them. Ethan met her gaze, his heart steadying. No disguises this time, he said, a nod to their past, his voice soft. I'm done hiding. Olivia's smile softened, her gaze holding his, a warmth beyond friendship flickering. Good. I like this Ethan better. She leaned forward, her presence a bridge. Art nodded, but his smile was thin. Just talking, Liv. He stood, returning to his workbench, steps slower, carrying a heavier load. Ethan watched Olivia, her fingers tracing her sketchbook's edge. Art, he said, voice steady. That school my dad wanted. You wanted it too, didn't you? To honor him. Art's hands froze, the wrench glinting. He looked up, eyes wide, then soft, like a candle's flicker at dusk. More than you know, he said, voice thick. But dreams like that, they need more than an old tuner. Ethan's pulse quickened, a fire kindling. They need us, he said, words spilling, certain. You, me, Olivia. You'd lead it, Art, teach, like you were meant to. This shop's music, it could live on in a school, even if these walls fall silent. I've spent years building walls with Apex, but this could rebuild what I lost, what we all lost with him. Olivia flipped open her sketchbook, sketching a logo, the same emblem that would one day shine on the Academy's sign. I'll design the Academy's look, something simple like Dad's work, she said, her pencil moving, a mirror of Art's craft, reflecting the skills she'd honed in her studio. Like the pendant you showed me, it's got soul. Picture kids like the one outside, their instruments finding a home. Art's gaze shifted between them, hands trembling, the wrench forgotten. His gaze softened. Ethan's words stirring a flicker of hope amidst his grief. "You're serious," he said, a realization, like a path through a shadowed grove. Ethan nodded, heart full, the emptiness lighter. "I am." He glanced at Olivia, her nod a promise, her hand brushing his, a spark of something more. Art's eyes held hope, fragile but real. Olivia stayed, her sketchbook open, her voice firm. "Dad's right," she said. "You're not empty. You're here." She remained as they spoke, her sketches a silent vow, slipping out only as the shop's light softened with dusk. The sun dipped, shadows dancing. The piano stood silent, but its presence was loud, a link to Thomas's spirit. Ethan felt it, the weight of his father's dream, Art's fear, his own longing, converging here, like travelers meeting at dusk on an unexpected road. Morning sun spilled over the old neighborhood, painting the Thomas Hayes and Arthur Monroe Community Music Academy in soft gold. Ethan stood at the entrance, his suit traded for a sweater, heart racing. Apex's demands loomed, but Ethan had reshaped his role, delegating to trusted teams, reserving evenings for the Academy's song. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make room for a purpose that felt like home. The building, once crumbling, now hummed with life. Fresh paint, polished floors, and laughter from children like those glimpsed outside the shop, their violins and flutes in hand, some preparing to perform, their notes a fledgling echo of the Academy's promise. Today was the opening, a dream reborn, and the air felt like dawn over a gentle rise. Art moved through the crowd, his silver hair gleaming, his blazer neat but comfortable. As the Academy's lead instructor, he was its heart, teaching with the passion he'd once feared lost. He greeted parents, adjusted a child's grip on a flute, his eyes bright with joy Ethan hadn't seen before. Olivia was there, her scarf bright against her dark hair, directing volunteers with a sketchbook in hand, who arranged instruments and guided guests, their efforts shaping the day's warmth. Her logo gleamed on the sign, born from her sketch that day in the shop, her designs woven into banners, a quiet echo of Art's craft. Ethan's eyes settled on the grand piano at the center, moved from the shop, its wood polished, no longer out of tune, a bridge to Thomas's heart. His fingers twitched. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, his father's favorite, stirring in his bones. The waltz they'd played together echoed in his mind, guiding his hands. He'd promised to play today, a tribute, but the weight pressed his chest. "Ready, son?" Art's voice cut through the chatter, gentle but firm, like a breeze through bamboo. He stood beside Ethan, hand brushing the piano, his gaze warm with pride. Ethan nodded, throat tight. "As I'll ever be." He sat at the bench, the crowd quieting, faces expectant. Olivia caught his eye from the front row, handing him a program, her design on the cover. "No tricks today?" she whispered, her nudge a shared memory of his delivery guy disguise. He grinned, her warmth an anchor. He took a breath, fingers finding the keys, and began. The sonata flowed, slow and haunting, each note a thread to his father, Art, the boy he'd been. The room vanished. Only the music remained, steady like a heart beating again. The final chord lingered, silence heavy with awe. Applause erupted, but Ethan barely heard it. He looked at Art, whose eyes glistened, a nod saying more than words. Olivia's hands were clasped, her smile wide, a silent, "You did it." Children tugged at Art, parents shook Ethan's hand, then joined the celebration, their voices blending with the children's laughter, a chorus of new beginnings. A few played alongside Art, their music a new beginning. Ethan stepped into the sunlight, needing air. The courtyard was quiet, sun climbing, its warmth a balm. Art joined him, blazer unbuttoned, hands in pockets. "You played like Thomas," he said, voice soft, like a stream over stone. "He'd carry this with you." Ethan's chest ached, full, not pained. "Couldn't have done it without you," he murmured, meeting Art's gaze. "This place, it's his dream, but it's yours too." Art shook his head, a faint smile. "Ours," he corrected, eyes sweeping the Academy's facade. "And theirs." He nodded toward the children spilling out, their laughter mingling with a violin's tentative notes. Olivia appeared, sketchbook tucked away, her hand brushing Ethan's arm, her touch a promise of something growing, tender and unspoken. "You okay?" she asked, her eyes searching, her logo shining on the sign behind her. "Better than okay," Ethan said, his grin real. Apex loomed, but here, with Art, Olivia, and the Academy, he was whole. The balance he'd craved, music, purpose, connection, felt within reach. They stood together, watching the children chase each other across the lawn, instruments forgotten for a moment. The piano's echo lingered in Ethan's mind, a melody of healing, not complete but shared. Art's hand rested on his shoulder, Olivia's fingers laced with his, their touch a quiet understanding, like hands clasped at dusk. The shop, now closed, had passed its soul to the academy, its piano a gift to carry Art's legacy forward. The sun rose higher, shadows dancing. The academy's sign gleamed, a promise kept. Ethan took a breath, the air sweet with possibility, and let it out, the moment settling like a tender dawn, no twist needed. Just peace. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that hope can be found in the most surprising moments, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Heartwarming Love Story. We bring you stories that touch the soul, renew your belief in kindness, and highlight what's truly important in life.